March 1815, and when hated by the entire continent of Europe, escapes his exile on the island of Elba and lands in France. The king sends an army to kill just one man, but the former ruler of France steps forward all alone and shouts, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, if there is anyone among you who wants to kill his emperor, shoot. Here I am." And that silence falls. And then the soldiers lower their rifles, weep and shout, "Long live the emperor!" Without firing a single shot, he takes his country back. You know the name of this emperor perfectly well, but his life is much deeper than you think. To understand how he won the devotion of hundreds of thousands, we need to go back to the very beginning. In 1769, a little boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born. His name still spelled in the Italian style back then. His family was noble, but incredibly poor and large. At this time, the world is ruled by absolute monarchs, whose power is passed down by bloodline. But the ideas of the Enlightenment are already in the air, and the old monarchical world is cracking at the seams. A year before our protagonist's birth, France bought the island of Corsica from Genoa. Napoleon's father swears allegiance to the new French authorities just to secure a spot for his son in an elite military school on the mainland. At age 9, Bonaparte is sent to a military academy in France. He is a poor provincial boy among wealthy French aristocrats. They mock him for his poverty and his thick Corsican accent. He retreats into himself, obsessively reading Roman history, mathematics, and treatises on artillery. Back then, artillery was considered a branch of service for nerds. You had to calculate trajectories, while the prestigious cavalry was reserved for the rich elites. But those rich elites have no idea that this nerd will soon turn their old world upside down. And then, in 1789, the French Revolution breaks out. The world plunges into chaos. Aristocrats are executed. But for our protagonist, this chaos is a ladder. In the old world, he would have remained a poor artilleryman forever. Now, origin doesn't matter. Talent decides everything. And Bonaparte's time has come. 1793. Revolutionary chaos grips France. The king's head is chopped off. European monarchies unite in horror against the Republic, terrified that the revolutionary contagion will spread to their own land. War breaks out. Inside France, terror reigns. The old military leadership has either fled or been executed. Enemy armies are at the gates. And this is where Napoleon's star ignites. The 24-year-old artillery captain accidentally receives an assignment near Toulon, a strategic naval base in the south that royalists had surrendered to the British and Spanish fleets. Bonaparte realizes immediately that charging the city's walls head-on is useless. He proposes a daring plan: seize the dominant high ground and blast the enemy fleet directly out of the bay. The plan works flawlessly. Under a barrage of heavy fire, British ships panic and abandon the harbor. Through his personal bravery, during the battle, a horse was killed under him and his side was pierced by a bayonet. The 24-year-old captain is fast-tracked and promoted to brigadier general, but deep down, he is still an isolated, awkward Corsican. In 1795, he meets Josephine, a widow older than him. He falls madly in love, but she treats him coldly and condescendingly. This unrequited passion becomes his nuclear fuel. With thoughts of her, he sets off to conquer Italy. He inherits the army of Italy, 30,000 starving, barefoot soldiers without pay or ammunition. Against them stands an 80,000 strong, well-fed and disciplined Austrian army. Napoleon masters maneuver warfare to absolute perfection. His soldiers march 50 kilometers a day, leaving heavy baggage trains behind. His tactic is simple: divide and conquer. Attack the enemy corps piece by piece, creating a local numerical advantage at the one specific point. Napoleon proves he is not coward. At the Battle of Lodi, he personally aims cannons under heavy fire, earning the affectionate nickname the Little Corporal from his men. At Arcoli, banner in hand, he charged onto the bridge himself. By the way, many historians believe that these were not real feats of Napoleon, but simply an act of propaganda. His aide-de-camp dies shielding the general with his own body. In the end, Napoleon utterly crushed the Austrians and forces their empire to beg for peace. Caravans of gold and masterpieces of art flood into Paris. Napoleon becomes a superstar. The government, the Directory, begins to fear him. By the way, I'm making a separate video about the French Revolution soon, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. To get the dangerous general as far away as possible, the Directory approves his wild plan: invade Egypt in order to gain access to the gateway to Britain's main colony in India. In Egypt, Napoleon faces the Mamluks, an elite cavalry that ruled the land. He forms his troops into massive squares, bayonet-bristling blocks with cannons at the corners. French discipline grinds the medieval cavalry to dust in just a few hours. At the same time, Napoleon brings 160 scientists with him, effectively found in Egyptology. The French managed to find the Rosetta Stone, which would later unlock the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. But then, British Admiral Horatio Nelson burns the French fleet to the ground at the Battle of the Nile in Aboukir Bay. Napoleon is trapped in Egypt. Plague breaks out in the army. Realizing the campaign is doomed, Bonaparte secretly abandons his troops and sails back to France. But thanks to powerful propaganda and the brought back artifacts, Paris welcomes him not as a deserter, but as the nation's sole saver. People need a firm hand. France is exhausted by revolutionary terror and corruption. This leads to Napoleon staging the coup of 18th Brumaire. Napoleon enters the legislative hall unarmed but with a guard. He starts getting incredibly nervous and is nearly torn apart by the furious deputies. The situation is saved by his brother Lucien, who goes out to the soldiers and claims that deputies are attempting to assassinate their general. The deputies are cleared out and Bonaparte secures power. He becomes consul and proves to be a legislative genius. Within a few years, he creates his famous civil code, which equalizes people before the law and buries feudalism forever. This document remains the bedrock of law across Europe to this day. Then, Napoleon decides to officially take all power into his own hands by becoming emperor. He invites the Pope, and at first, everything seems standard. But at the coronation, he pulls off an incredibly bold move. He snatches the crown out of the Pope's hands and places it on his own head. His message was clear: neither God nor man gives me this power. I take it myself. And a year later on the battlefield, in 1805, at Austerlitz, he demonstrates his sheer might. The Battle of the Three Emperors takes place. Napoleon orchestrates a brilliant theatrical play. He pretends to be weak, surrenders the strategic heights, and lures the Russian-Austrian army into trap. At dawn, under the rays of the famous sun of Austerlitz, he delivers a crushing blow and brings Europe to its knees. He destroys the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire and turns Prussia and Austria into virtually his puppet states. In 1807, he signs the Treaty of Tilsit with Russia, concluding a secret alliance treaty of mutual assistance, pledging to act together in any offensive or defensive war. A year later, in 1808, he places his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne and occupies Portugal. 2 years after that, Napoleon annexes the Kingdom of Holland and captures Rome. Finally, he defeats Austria once more and appends the northern coast of Germany to his territories. Napoleon also realizes he cannot defeat Britain at sea, so he introduces the continental blockade, forbidding Europe from trading with the British. This infuriates all his allies, including Russia, and this anger will soon put an end to everything. But alas, this is exactly where Bonaparte's hubris begins. Believing he is infallible, Napoleon takes a step that shocks society. He divorces the love of his life, Josephine, because she cannot bear him an heir. Politics triumphs over feelings. He marries an Austrian princess, the niece of that wary Marie Antoinette. 1820. Anger at Russia for violating the blockade turns into a total catastrophe. Napoleon gathers an unprecedented army in history, 600,000 men, and invades Russia. He is absolutely certain a couple of weeks and Alexander I will be on his knees begging for peace. But the Russians retreat, burning everything in their path. Bonaparte takes Moscow, but instead of the keys to the city, he gets a cataclysmic fire. The blaze was so fierce it spread to the Kremlin. Napoleon had to navigate the burning streets on foot, his hair and coat literally singeing from flying sparks. He found himself trapped in the fiery cage of his own victory. Paralyzed by pride, he waits too long for a surrender in the ruined city, and this delay proves fatal. The retreat begins, turning into a freezing hell. General winter, starvation, and Russian partisans simply wipe out the Grand Army. Out of 600,000 men, barely a tenth make it back. The emperor is in such a panic over the possibility of capture that he orders a small black silk pouch to be made and starts constantly wearing a vial of potent poison around his neck. Yes, just like Frederick the Great during the 7th Years' War, which you can watch in my previous video. All of Europe rushes to finish off the wounded lion. In 1814, the enemy takes Paris. Broken and betrayed by his own marshals, Napoleon signs his abdication and drinks that very poison. But over 2 years, the powder had lost its potency. Bonaparte only suffered from agonizing stomach pains, survived, and was sent into humiliating exile on the tiny island of Elba. And here, we loop our narrative back to the beginning. Remember the start of the video? March 1815, a daring escape, a confrontation with the 5th Regiment in the mountains, a grey overcoat thrown wide open. Shoot your emperor! And just like that, he is back on the throne without firing a single shot. The legendary 100 days begin. During this time, Napoleon triumphantly adopted a new democratic constitution and abolished censorship to regain the trust of the French. However, he didn't have time to cement his reforms. Europe declared war on him, and after his defeat at Waterloo, his empire fell forever. Why did the master tactician lose everything? First, the fatal mud. It rained heavily all night, and his heavy cannons sank into the soil. Napoleon had to wait until noon for the field to dry out. And those exact hours were what he lacked to crush the British before the Prussian army arrived. Second, the emperor himself was no longer the same. The 45-year-old overweight man, suffering from a severe flare-up of hemorrhoids, physically couldn't stay in the saddle for long to actively control the battle, and his marshals arrived catastrophically late. Thus, mud, coincidences, and physical pain put a definitive end to the history of the greatest empire. He is sent to a tiny piece of rock lost in the Atlantic, the island of St. Helena. The British sent him so far away that the return would be physically impossible. Here, in 1821, at age of 51, the emperor dies. The official diagnosis is stomach cancer. The unofficial one, which still captivates minds today, is arsenic poisoning from the toxic green wallpaper lining his damp room. The victors hoped that by hiding the Corsican monster at the edge of the world, they would erase him from the history. But can you really forget a man who rewrote the rules of the game for the entire planet? Napoleon lost his crown, but his invisible empire exists to this day. He literally dragged Europe out the stagnant Middle Ages into the modern era, but this progress came at horrific price. The Napoleonic Wars became an unprecedented meat grinder, claiming between 3 and 6 million lives. The scale of the catastrophe was so colossal that it literally alerted the nation's physiology. Because France spent decades sending its tallest, strongest, and healthiest men to the slaughter, the average height of Frenchmen in the next generation officially dropped by several centimeters. He shattered old feudal empires but built his own tyrannical one. He gave people rights but paid for them with oceans of blood. And yet, history loves paradoxes. The monarchs who tried to erase Bonaparte's memory faded ignominiously into oblivion themselves. Meanwhile, Napoleon achieved his final triumph. 19 years after his death, in 1840, the British yield and allow his remains to be returned to France. In the biting December cold, all of Paris pours out into the streets. A massive crowd, tears in their eyes, meets the funeral procession. The emperor defeated his jailers. Today, he rests in the very heart of Paris, inside a magnificent tomb at Les Invalides. As he faded away in exile, Napoleon himself spoke prophetic words. "My true glory is not having won 40 battles. Waterloo will whip out the memory of them, but what will never be forgotten is my civil code." And here, he was absolutely right. This document remains the foundation of law in many countries around the world, protecting the freedoms he fought for. So who was he really? A bloodthirsty tyrant whose ambitions scorched Europe, or a great enlightened reformer, the architect of our modern world? What do you think? Write your opinion in the comments, let's debate. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next videos.